All right, and we're back discussing the distributive property. Now we're going to take a look at factors 9, 10, 11, and 12 as part of the distributive property. We're going to start with 9. Now, you might not be very comfortable with your 9 facts, and that's completely acceptable. However, there are different ways that you can use the distributive property to break apart that 9 into two easier to work with numbers, add those partial products back together, and get your final answer. So we're going to look at the problem, the math fact, 9 times 5. Most of us will be able to count by multiples of 5 to find that out. However, this could be a 6 or a 7, and then you might be even more uncomfortable with that fact. I want to always break up the larger number inside a distributive property problem. I always want to break up the larger number because I know how to multiply by 5, but I'm not so sure about multiplying by 9. So here it gives you 3 different ways you can break up 9. 1 plus 8, or 8 plus 1. 2 plus 7, or 7 plus 2. 3 plus 6, or 6 plus 3. And 4 plus 5, or 5 plus 4. Those are just the inverses, the flip-flop. And so my problem now, 9 times 5, is now written in 3 different ways. This one I broke down the 9 into the 1 and the 8. My 5 stays the same. I'm not changing my 5. I'm only changing my 9. So now I have 2 smaller problems. 1 times 5, I know that's 5. And 8 times 5. And I can count by multiples of 5 to find that out if I don't know that in my head. I get 5 plus 40 gives me 45. 9 times 5 is 45. That's exactly what we wanted. I just used 2 smaller problems to find it out. Over here I broke the 9 into 2 and 7. So I have 2 plus 5, 5 stays the same. 7 times 5. Add it up. 2 times 5 is 10. 7 times 5 is 35. 10 plus 35 gives me 45. Same product, same problem, broken up differently. Here we have another way of breaking the 9 up into 3 and 6. 3 times 5 is 15. 6 times 5 is 30. Add the 15 and the 30. 45. I'm still getting the same product, just a different way. Here I broke it up into 4 and 5. 4 times 5 is 20. 5 times 5 is 25. Add the 20 and the 25 gives me 45. I have the same product for each of my problems because I have essentially the same problem. All of these are the same problem as 9 times 5. I just broke the 9 up. I just broke it up from this one little baby problem, 9 times 5, and I made 2 smaller problems and then add them back together. Okay, here's the distributive property for factors 10 and 11. These two are a little bit different because when you're multiplying by 10 or 11, you find out that there's a pattern to it. There's a rhythm behind it, and you think it's just because you're skip counting. You're actually counting by multiples, but there's also another way to look at multiplying by 10 or 11. When you're going to multiply by 10, you notice a pattern. You say 1 times 10 is 10. 10 times 2 is 20. 10 times 3 is 30. 10 times 4 is 40. What you notice is that you're increasing each time by 10. What the book wants me to tell you is how you would do this is to place a 0 to the right of the other factor. So if our problem is 10 times 5, place a 0 behind the 5, and that's it. You get, what's a 0 behind a 5? A 5 and a 0, that gives me 50. How I like to look at it is I like to multiply the other factor, 5, times the 1 in 10. So 5 times 1. And then I want to add that 0 to that answer. So essentially I have 10 times 5, but I'm going to look at 1 times 5. That's going to give me 5. And then I'm going to take that 0 that I didn't use when I multiplied and just bring it down here and drop it right next to the 5, which gives me 50. 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. 10 groups of 5 or 5 groups of 10 is 50. So when you're multiplying by 10, remember, multiply by 1, then add the 0 to the other factor. For 11, 11 can get a little tricky because it looks like you're just doubling your answer. For 11 times 1, we have 11. It looks like I just doubled the other factor. 11 times 2, 22. It looks like I just doubled this 2. 11 times 3, 33. It looks like I just doubled it. And that's a good rule until you get to 11 times 10, 11 times 11, 11 times 12. It's not a double anymore. So I wouldn't suggest you to follow that rule for multiplying times 11. I would tell you to use what the book tells you to do. And that tells you to multiply the other factor, not the 11, by 10, which we know how to do. Then we add the factor back to that product. So if we're doing 11 times 5, I want to multiply the other factor, the 5, not the 11, by 10. So 5 times 10 is 50. We just went over it. Then I want to add another group of that factor, another 5 to that 50. So 50 plus 5 gives me 55. 11 times 5 is 55. But like I said, it looks like it just doubled, but it doesn't just double, because when you get into the 11 times 10, 11 times 11, it's not going to be doubled numbers. So you have to be careful. I would suggest multiplying that number by 10 and then adding another group of that number. This is important for you to write down. All right, the factor of 12. The factor of 12 is really fun because 12 can actually be broken up into so many ways. 1 and 11, 2 and 10, 3 and 9, 4 and 8, 6 and 6, 7 and 5. I mean, it's just, it can keep going. I could go on and do a whole video about how to break up 12. But what I'm going to suggest to you is that the most simple way to break 12 up into is to 10 and 2. Because we know how to multiply by 10 and count by multiples of 10. And for the most part, we know how to multiply by 2 and count by multiples of 2. So those are just two easier numbers we can work with. If we're looking at our 12s table, or our 12 facts, 12 times 1 is 12, 12 times 2 is 12 times 2 is 24, 12 times 3 is 36, 12 times 4 is 48. So say we want to do 12 times 5, but we don't know. And we're not really good at counting by multiples of 5. So we want to break this up. We want to use distributive property to break it up into two smaller problems so then I can add it up. Break the 12 into 10 and 2. My 5 stays the same. My 5's the same. But my 12 is broken up into 10 and 2. So now I have the two smaller problems, 10 times 5, which is 50, and 2 times 5, which is 10. And I can just add both of those up, which gives me 60. Always break apart the 12 into 10 and 2. It's just easier to work with, right? All right. And this is our last slide. These are some key points I want you to remember and be able to come to class tomorrow being able to discuss. Number 1, the distributive property breaks up only one factor. If I have the problem 12 times 8, I'm not going to break up the 12 and the 8. I need to pick which one I'm most uncomfortable with for that fact group and break that one up. Most likely you should break up the 12 because it's bigger. After you break up the factors and you multiply each one and now you have two pretty little numbers, you must add the two products back together to get the final product, or you didn't answer the problem correctly. You did the distributive property method almost correctly, but that one little step down at the bottom, I found that most students forget to add those two partial products back together, and that's what catches them and messes them up most of the time. So always remember, you must add them back together. And remember, always break up the larger factor. It's easier if you break up the larger factor. The whole reason why you're doing the distributive property is probably because you are uncomfortable with that math multiplication fact. If you are uncomfortable with it, it is most likely because it is a larger number, a 9, an 8, and you're not comfortable with those facts. So always break up the larger factor. I have 4 problems here that I want you to try tonight, and I want you to break up the larger number for each one, add it back together, and come to class tomorrow ready to discuss these key points, what you learned in these videos, and the answers to these questions. I need to see your work written down on paper, please. Thanks.